everybody, Carl Schoof here from Snorkel.tv, and today we're going to be talking about how we can use filter effects on movie clips to give our flat and boring vector artwork some really nice depth and lighting effects. On the screen here you will see this ladybug following a motion guide, and what I want to point out is that the bright highlight area that's affecting the top left of this movie clip here always stays in the top left hand corner, so we have the illusion that there is a light source casting its light from the top left, and there's always going to be a shadow on the bottom right section of this ladybug, giving it a bit of a rounded edge to it, sort of a bevel effect if you will, that's realistic. And there's also a very slight drop shadow that's also following that ladybug around. So I'm just going to very quickly explain to you how we can use the gradient glow filter and the drop shadow filter with some very specific settings to get a really nice subtle lighting effect and this extra edge of 3D depth. So let's close this out, and in my start file you'll notice that my ladybug is really just a very plain and flat piece of vector artwork. We'll watch this thing animate, and yeah, it's okay, but it's really, there's a world difference between this and what you just saw. Okay, so we're going to add a little touch of realism to this ladybug by adding a little bit of a three-dimensional edge and that pseudo lighting effect. Alright, so let me close this SWIF out. Very simply, or quickly I should say, here we have our timeline. There's a guide layer, which is this yellow line. We have the ladybug doing a classic tween, and so it's following that line, as you can see. And then we have our leaf layer. Alright, it's a very simple file. I'm going to go to the last frame of this movie, because in the last frame we can actually see the full ladybug here. And I'm just going to click on it, and you will see that it is a movie clip called Ladybug. Now for the lighting effect, where I want to have sort of a bright glare on the top left of this symbol here and a shadow down below, I'm going to do it just to a symbol inside of the ladybug, because I really don't want that effect on the head and the antennae. So this ladybug includes, inside of ladybug, I have something called wings, okay? So the 3D effect is just going to affect the wings and not the head and the antennas. When I had it affect the whole clip, it didn't look so hot up here. So we just want the wings now to have a little bit of depth to them. So I'm going to select this movie clip, and since it is a movie clip, in the properties panel we're allowed to add filters to it. And the first filter we're going to add is the gradient glow filter. Now what you see right away is that this filter doesn't look too interesting here. It looks like it just added a little drop shadow around the edge here. Well, there are a lot of specific settings that we can set to really fine-tune this effect. First thing, I want this gradient glow to give us sort of a reflection or glare on our little ladybug, and so I want to have sort of a white brightness to this effect. So in the gradient settings, I'm going to make sure that instead of using black, I'm going to use a white color, and I'm also going to make sure that white isn't full blast alpha of 100, and I don't want to be blinded, so we're just going to chuck this down to around 75%. Again, you know, what I got going here isn't exactly, you know, what I'm looking for. A big thing that's going to change the way this looks is by setting the type to be, instead of outer, I'm going to say inner. So now the gradient glow affects the inside of the shape and not the outside. Well, that's still a far cry from what I'm looking for, so we're going to blur this out a little bit. I don't want it to be so hard-edged here. So for the blur, I'm going to crank this up to about 144, and let me just undo that. I want to make sure my X and Y blurs are constrained. So when I change blur X, blur Y is going to get changed. And so what I'm doing here is I'm pretty much softening up the way this blur is going to work. Okay, this gradient glow, I'm sorry. So let's just bring this up to about 144. And so you see now I have this soft glow here, but the light source looks like it's shining straight down from on top of the ladybug. And I want to offset this to be coming from the top left-hand corner. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the angle here, or actually let's go to the distance, and we can move it around and we can pull it back. So here, by pulling the distance to a negative value, you can see that it's sort of moving to that upper top left corner. And I'm just going to be happy somewhere around like -110. And I'm going to shift it over a little bit. We can just change the angle. So the angle allows us to move it around the ladybug now. And somewhere around 50 is just fine. So you can see that it's just a very subtle highlight shading effect that we have going on here. For the strength, I might just bring that up a little bit, just so it's a little bit more pronounced. Okay, so there we go. That's what the gradient glow is going to do for us. We're glowing from 75% white out to transparent, and it gives us, you know, a nice little subtle depth and shading. But to increase this, we're going to say that, well, if light is hitting this rounded object from the top left corner, you would expect there to be a shadow on the bottom right. So I'm going to go ahead and add another filter. So take a guess what the next filter we're going to add will be. Yes, the drop shadow filter. Now when I add this filter, by default, it doesn't give me anything close to what I want. The drop shadow is outside of the wings right here, and I want it to be on the inside of the wings to add just a little bit of shading here. So I'm going to click on inner shadow, and what's that? That's not exactly what I want either. I'm going to rotate this shadow so that the dark part is in the bottom right hand corner. So where I have the angle here, I'm just going to crank that up a bit, and you'll see that as this number increases, that shadow is moving to the bottom right. And I think somewhere around like 225 is going to be fine for me. Now this shadow is very pronounced right now. I want to soften it up a little bit. So we're going to add a blur of about 20 pixels. All right, and so now it's softer, but it's very, very dark, okay? Well, to get around that, I'm not going to use a black shadow. I'm going to change the color, and we're just going to select this maroon color for now. Okay, and then you'll see the shadow virtually goes away, but it's very subtle here along this section of the wings. To make it a little bit more pronounced, we're going to take the strength and crank that up a little bit. So let's bring that up to about, I don't know, 120 or so. Okay, so now we see a little bit more of the shadow. But again, it's not going to be very, drastic. We're going for subtlety here. Also adjust the distance, and so that's going to bring it in a little bit. Okay, so now you just see we have this nice soft edge here. Well, what I'm not too fond of is what I'm getting right here, where you see this hard line cutting across the gradient glow that we're using here. And why that's happening is because the shadow is being applied to the top wing piece and the bottom wing piece. There's two separate shapes inside of this symbol. So to get rid of this little edge here, I'm going to just set the quality of the shadow to be high. And by doing that, you'll notice that it softens up real nice there. So here, it's just a very subtle drop shadow effect that we have. And that's only 2 filters that we've added. So let's go ahead and test this movie out. And there you go. So we went from that really flat, ugly looking wing to now this sort of dome shape, if you will. And what's really cool about this again is that the filters are always aware of the angle that the light source is coming from. So it's always going to be shining at the top left of the symbol, regardless of which way the symbol is rotated. To make this point even more clear, what I'm going to do is actually take this symbol, I can copy it and go into a separate file, and I'm just going to paste it 3 times. Okay, I did a Command V 3 times, and it's clear here that the glare is on the top left and the shadow's on the bottom right. But if I take this guy and spin his head down here, you'll notice the glare always stays up there, as if the light source was always coming from the top left. This guy here, I'll just spin like this. So it's actually pretty cool how we can spin the object around, but the shading always remains true. Now, in my start file, I want to add a little drop shadow to the entire Ladybug movie clip, because right now this ladybug sitting on top of the green leaf, it looks too fake. If I want to really get some realism here for this ladybug, I want to make sure that, maybe itself is casting a little bit of a shadow and it's not just sitting flat on this leaf. Okay, so back in frame 1, we're just going to add a very simple drop shadow quickly. I'm going to say let's add a drop shadow. Let's bring your blur up to about 10. And you'll notice that that drop shadow, it's a little on the dark side. And one thing I'm going to do is just set the quality to high. And that just softens it a little bit and makes it look really cool. And on the last frame of this timeline, we're way out here, I'm going to select the same movie clip. Now, as soon as I put the drop shadow on the first frame, Flash puts a drop shadow with no settings on the last frame. So I'm just going to set the blur here to be 10 also, and the quality to high. And so now throughout the entire, the strength is down to 0. Let's make that 100. All right, there we go. So now as that little ladybug moves along the timeline, there's always going to be just a very slight drop shadow on the bottom right. And so let's just take a look at the finished version. And there you go. So regardless of how he's spinning, there's always a drop shadow on the bottom. And let me just slow this down incredibly. Let's make it 10 frames per second. And so here he is chugging along. And there's the drop shadow always on the bottom right, regardless of where he's turning, and that glare always stays up here. Okay, so again, I urge you guys to try out this technique, and I really just want to thank you guys for all the comments you've been leaving. My site traffic's been doing really well lately, thanks to you. But please keep up the great work. Tell your friends, tweet about this stuff if you like it, and if there's anything else you want to see, shoot me a comment or get in touch on Facebook. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.